We will be continuing our series in the book of James. Such a wonderful book that God wrote through the mind of James. We're going to be chapter 2, starting in verse 14. Through the mind of James, God masterfully and wonderfully asked the reader, that is us, and those at the time, questions about their faith and their works. Questions that God then, through the mind of James, answers with another question. So he answers a question with a question in the text. And we'll get to see some of these powerful questions and their powerful answers as we go through. So let us begin by looking at chapter 2, verse 14. What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is it? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead by itself. Before we move on in the text and look deeply at it, let me point out a few interesting things. Let us notice that in verse 15, it says that the person is a brother or a sister. And that puts this conversation in a special category of people. Also notice verse 16, where it says, one of you says to them, "Go in peace." So what is this helping us to understand? It says that they're saying go in peace. And so the text is equating or making equal what you say to what you believe. So you say, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled." And that's an indication of your faith. That is an indication of your faith. Let's look at something else. And yet do not give what is necessary for their body. This is helping us to understand that the person that believes has the faith that they should be warm and filled, yet doesn't have the works behind it, their faith is dead. Their faith is dead. That's what the text says. In this case, the one who speaks is not acting in accordance with what they believe. So what is the use of it if you have a sister who recently was disabled because of an injury at work, and she has kids and she needs to go to physical therapy, and she tells you these things, and you think to yourself, well, you sure could use a babysitter, but you don't go and help them? Or what use is it if you say to someone, well, the church needs people that are going to go out there and evangelize, but then you spend time sitting on your couch watching the Huskers game? Just saying. What use is it if when you say, "I trust in God," but when the coronavirus comes, you don't pray to Him to keep you safe? All of these cases and more have to do with your faith and how you believe. And if you are acting in accordance with that belief. Because if not, your faith is dead. Your faith is dead. Let's look at verse 18 now. Let's look at verse 18. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Now, when looking at the development of the text here, it is like looking at a separate branch on a tree, as you see on the screen. It's like looking at a separate branch on a tree. The tree of, what use is it? That's what I'm going to call it. That's the name of the tree. What use is it? And this branch is going to open up into a beautiful flower that brings more beauty to this text through the mind of James regarding our faith. So, these are going to be the deeds that indicate his faith. He says, I will show you my faith by my works. He's going to go through the text here and help us to understand these various aspects. I will show you my faith by my works. You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works. You can think of these almost as two separate parts. And as we go through the next few verses, really 19 through 26, you're going to see him explain these and kind of elaborate on them a little bit. So let's go through them together. Verse 19. It says, you believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. So God reveals to us that when you believe, you are doing well. That's good. But just believing puts you on equal grounds with the demons, who at least they shudder or tremble because they believe. Now let's reflect on the statement that is made in verse 18. It said that you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works. Stop. So what is it saying? It's saying that you who are separating your faith and your works are on par with the demons. That's something for pause, right? You are on par with the demons because that's what they do. I certainly don't want to be there. I certainly don't want to stay there. I certainly don't want to stay there. So, let's see what else. It says, continuing on, in verse 20, but are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? That faith without works is useless. So, notice this now. When you take your works and your faith and you don't have them together, you're on the side of this tree in which your faith is, one, it's dead. Two, it's describing you as on par or on the same ground as demons. And three, you're foolish, or you are exercising foolishness in having this belief or this understanding. I know of some that strongly believe that you can simply believe in order to be saved. Simply believe in order to be saved. Now, we don't want to disregard the need for belief because it says here clearly in the text in verse 19, you believe that God is one, you do well, and we all do if we believe that God is one. But that's not enough. That's not enough. Let's look at what else we can discover in the text. What is it? What use is it, my brethren? That's the initial question. What use is it? I don't know if you noticed this, but that question, along with the other questions that were asked of the text in the first few verses, were just answered. But he answered it with a question. Let me show you. The very first question is this: what use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Verse 14. Well, what is the answer? It says in verse 20, it says, faith without works is useless. So, it's useless. You have no faith, you have no works, your faith is useless. Let's look at the next question that the text asks and then answers with a question. It says, can faith save him? Rather, can that faith save him? It's pointing back to the faith that is separate from the works. And so, what is the answer to that question? No. Faith separate from the works cannot save. Why? Because it's useless. It asks a third question and answers with a question. Let's look at the third question. It says, if a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, yet you do not give them what is necessary for the body, what use is it? The answer? None. It has no use. Because you need the works with the faith. Now again, reflect on the verses that were just used, especially verse 18. You can start to see how this section is flowering, so to speak, and opening up. It's opening up so that it explains what verse 18 was saying. It says, but someone may well say, you have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without your works. We know what the end result of that is. It's useless. It's dead. You're on par with the demons. It's foolishness. And then it's going to, again, open up and answer the last part, or explain the last part, which is this: I will show you my faith by my works. Let's see what the text says. Let us read verses 21 through 26. 21 through 26. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not faith alone. In the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. I think it's somewhat apparent that James, by the will of God, says, show you my faith by my works, is making a point here with these two people, Abraham and Rahab, showing the connection of how they had faith and works and how it worked out for them. But let's go a little bit deeper and look at some things that we have to reflect back in the Old Testament for, so we can really understand or have a fuller picture of the truth. So, looking at Genesis chapter 15, we won't turn there unless you want to. Genesis chapter 15 and Genesis chapter 22, you can see the very beginning of what they're talking about here. Now the text, when it starts, it talks in verse 21 saying, Abraham, our father, was justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son. That's in Genesis 22. And then in chapter 2, verse 23, it says, and Abraham believed, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. It's almost flipped, because when you look in the Old Testament, first Abraham believed, because God came to him and said that I am going to give you many descendants. Even though he didn't have Isaac yet. He didn't have him yet, but he believed him. He believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. I submit to you, because God knows what to expect of Abraham, he reckoned it to him as righteousness. But then, as the text progresses, Sarah gives her maid to Abraham. Then they have that child. It didn't work out. Then later, years later, 10 plus years later, God gives Abraham and Sarah Isaac. He is born. Then God says, okay, I want you to go and sacrifice your son. So then he goes, gets ready to sacrifice his son. God says, don't. He says, Abraham, I'm paraphrasing here. He says, Abraham, he says, here I am. He says, I know that you fear me because you obeyed my voice. And so there are the works. So he believed that God was going to give him the descendants. But I want to show us something that helps to fill in perhaps some gaps in our mind about Abraham's reasoning and how he considered this, because I think it's very helpful, and obviously the Word of God gave it to us for us to read. So let's quickly look at Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11. And verse 17. We can gain some insight as to this mentality. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 and following. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise, that's when he said, I will give you many descendants, was offering up his only begotten son. And it was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He considered, this is his thinking, he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So what does this help us to understand and see? Well, we see that Abraham had this belief. He had the belief. He believed, but it was accounted to him as righteousness, or reckoned to him as righteousness, because it was joined with the works many, many, many years later. But it was all because he believed and joined it with the righteousness. Those two have to work together. Those two have to work together. Now, by way of application, sometimes God, he gives us a promise. He says, this will come about in your life. I will comfort you. I will provide for you. It's great that we believe it. But then do you take the necessary steps not to be anxious about that? Do you take the necessary steps to then go to pray to him? Do you take the necessary steps to trust in that? And in addition to that, what about the many, many hundreds and hundreds of commands? Do you believe that you should be doing that and follow through with that by taking action? It says that those who believe and are baptized will be saved. But then do you go and make sure that those who you're talking to tell them that baptism is necessary for salvation? We must put these things together. It is important in our lives as Christians to join our faith with our works, because we will be walking with a dead faith. We must put our faith, what we believe is the case, with the actions behind it. There's a saying that says talk is cheap. And even in our Christian walk at times, talk is cheap. We must act. So then, the lesson is yours in saying this, that if you are one that you believe that Jesus Christ is God, you believe there is a God, you believe that He is Lord, that is Master, then you need to take action to be obedient. This is applicable to both the Christian and the non-Christian, because we always have to treat God as our Master, the one who rules our life, the one who tells us what to do in word and deed. Because we don't want to have a dead faith, do we? If there's anybody that needs strength in their faith, that needs encouragement in their faith, please do not hesitate. Run to Him. If you draw near to Him, He'll draw near to you. As we stand and as we sing.